This is Human Coined, a series that unpacks the mechanics of public finance, the complexities of democracy, and the societies they ultimately shape. I'm your host, Geoff DeBro. Join me in a social dialogue that cracks open important issues that are too often ignored here at home and around the world. Jason Braganza from the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development. Welcome to Human Coined. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Hi, Geoff. Really great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Jason, let's start by maybe telling us a bit about AFRODAD. I have done podcasts in the past with civil society organizations, both in Africa and Asia, that focus on the issue of debt and development. How does AFRODAD fit into that picture? Tell us a bit about your organization.
Thanks, Geoff. Yeah, so the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, we were established over 25 years ago with the singular mandate of trying to provide and present an African perspective on issues of public debt and development finance in global discussions. And we were also part of the Jubilee Debt Campaign, debt cancellation movement of the early 2000s, and sort of used our mandate to bring together African civil society and mobilization of African citizens to call for the cancellation of debt in the early 2000s. Of course, our work has evolved over the past 25 years to integrate other types of development finance and also to integrate into understanding how the rest of the global economic and financial system works. So it's really about presenting this African perspective when we talk about global economic governance and global economic and financial systems and how they interact, and the role of African countries and Africa as a continent in these interactions.
And you talked about the global financial crisis of the 2000s. When it comes to debt in Africa, are we back where we started?
I think we're more than back. I think we've got further than we were in the 2000s when the call was for debt cancellation. The interconnectedness of global systems, trade, finance, economics, and even politics, for that matter, makes it a lot more complicated in terms of how the African continent interfaces with all these different elements. And the inability, to some extent, to negotiate strong terms and conditions, whether it's on political terms, whether it's on economic terms, whether it's on trading terms, means that the crises that we're currently facing is much more deeper than it probably was in the late 90s, early 2000s, that then gave rise to the debt cancellation movement. And I say this because we're not only dealing with an economic crisis, we're dealing with a health crisis, still reeling from the effects of the global pandemic. We're now dealing with a climate emergency that has, very far-reaching tentacles, not just on climatic and environmental sectors, but also has an impact on food systems and food production, which then has spillover effects on economic and social dimensions. And we're also dealing with a very volatile and insecure world. This week, we're talking about things that are going on in the Middle East. For the last 18 months or so, we've been dealing with the war in Europe. And so and also in Africa, we've had over the last 5-6 years quite a number of coups. And so we are, in a very volatile system and environment that makes these crises ever so much more deeper than they were perhaps in the 2000s, when it was more about trade economics at that time.
So my goal to help make the world a better place, obviously, has failed, which is unfortunate. But
we're getting there one step at a time, one crisis at a time, perhaps.
Be the change you want to see, right?
Yeah.
So tell me then, you talk about the inability to negotiate strong terms and conditions as being one of the reasons why the debt crisis is perhaps worse than it was in the 2000s during the financial crisis. Could you maybe just unpack that a little bit? Why has that happened? Is that yeah? Please just go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you look at it, as a continent, Africa has gradually, integrated itself into global trading systems and global finance in a lot more ways than it had been in the sort of 80s and 90s. And this is primarily through, the exports of primary commodities, the exports of raw materials that feed a lot of global and international industries. So, to a large extent, the continent is the world's source and hub of raw materials for many industries. Um, and unfortunately, the global trading system has not been able to adapt to the role Africa is playing in international trade and in international industrialization and industrial processes. And this inability then for African countries, governments, or as a continent to negotiate better terms of trade, better implementation of trade and investment policies, or even tax policies for that matter, that promote domestic establishment of industries and domestic businesses. We are now sort of still relying very much on this mantra that multinational corporations and foreign direct investments are the panacea for Africa's transformation. And so when you're negotiating terms on these sort of framework, it's very difficult to get the maximum revenues out of your primary commodities or your materials, because you're only exporting very raw basic materials that are low value. Yet the demands on those revenues in terms of your national population are ever expanding. And so this is how we find ourselves in a very difficult situation with several different types of deficits, fiscal deficits, trade deficits, balance of payments deficits, essentially then just forcing the arm of our governments to then borrow. And this then also becomes part of this vicious cycle because you're desperate to fill the deficits in order to provide for your citizens. And so the terms of the borrowing or the terms of debt are not necessarily in your favor as the borrower, but they tend to favor the lender or the creditor, as it were. And there's a lot of sort of proliferation that has taken place in the creditor landscape, where there's a lot more private credit available to many African countries. And so this is what I mean by the inability to negotiate good and fair terms by African governments in this current environment, and hence the crises. Sort of linked to that, I think also is the ideological underpinning of what is going to facilitate or enable Africa to transform. I think there's this false idea that it's only going to be markets and private sector and foreign private sector for that matter. And so this is also very problematic because what it's doing is eroding the role of the African state in providing for its citizens and outsourcing that to private agents, foreign private agents, I should emphasize. And that brings with itself its own sets of problems, including marginalization and exclusion from being able to access certain types of investments or services that are being implemented by these agencies. So it's a very contradictory set of approaches where, on the one hand, you're told private sector and market liberalization is the solution. But when you look at the state of the continent and state of many African economies and the state of the populations, it gives you a very contradictory sort of picture and reading where the analysis is extremely dire for those who follow it very closely.
So were you in Marrakesh at the recent IMF World Bank meetings?
I'm not. My colleagues are, but
Your colleagues
I know
are.
there's a lot of stuff happening right there. Yes.
Yeah. So just as an example, what kind of messages? Because what you're dealing with, and if you look on, I spent some time on your website getting ready for this interview, and obviously you have a very multifaceted approach around debt transparency, debt and development, debt restructuring, et cetera, et cetera. When it comes to the inequities in the market, and really what you're saying is, this is very much the old this is very neo-colonial, right? The ongoing, the selling of exporting of raw materials to the West, for example. What kind of messages are you getting across to multilateral organizations like the IMF and the World Bank?
So there's 3 or 4 messages, actually. I think the first one is that, no more debt. We cannot afford to continue borrowing our way out of this crisis and this multiple crisis or poly crisis, as the UN Secretary General refers to it, that we're currently living in. There needs to be a lot more radical fiscal space creation. And to some extent, where countries are just not able to pay, I think a serious consideration needs to be given to debt cancellation for some African countries. And I don't say this lightly. When
Yeah.
you look at the principles of how borrowing should be done, there are very strong possibilities to make legal arguments that a lot of the debt that Africa has accumulated over the years is illegitimate and therefore
Illegitimate debt.
odious and therefore not repayable. And we've started seeing this in some landmark cases like in Mozambique. And I'm pretty sure your listenership are
Yes.
familiar with the tuna bond scandal and the role of Credit Suisse in the lending to the government of Mozambique. And so I think there is more of this that needs to be analyzed and a lot more of this that needs to be assessed to understand the extent to which really African governments and African people should be paying these debts. I think that's the first one. So no more debts, and in some cases, and in many cases, I think debt cancellation. I think the second one is we need to really be serious about what we mean by international financial architecture reform. We cannot have the same institutions being part of this new set of systems or new set of architecture because they are the propagators of the problems that we're currently facing. And so certainly the IMF and the World Bank, we need to question the legitimacy of these two institutions in global macroeconomic governance and macroeconomic stability. I've been reading just this past week that the World Bank is talking about a lost decade for Africa, and yet in the same breath, it's talking about leading the charge on climate finance and talking about getting further debt financing instruments to support climate emergency and climate finance as part of the energy transition. So a lot of contradictory messages there, that these institutions have been putting out for many years.
Mm-hmm.
And we really need to be serious about calling this out. And if we do want to reform and change the architecture. The third one I think is around, or I feel is around, overhauling the debt architecture. And we have a huge opportunity here to relook at how the global debt architecture is currently organized. With the proliferation and addition of a lot more creditors, the non-traditional lenders, bilateral lenders, particularly China, Brazil, India, Turkey, being very big players in the creditor market, as well as commercial creditors. A lot of equity firms, investment banks that are supporting African governments develop and issue sovereign bonds. This requires a whole new set of rules and a whole new set of governance structure that these creditors need to abide by in terms of their rules of engagement with debtor countries. We need to look at the role of credit rating agencies because they too act in a very disruptive way as an indicator of who can and cannot borrow. We've seen them also act in very schizophrenic manners. If you follow them very closely, you can see, for example, if you ask to restructure your debt, you immediately get a downgrade, and many countries, therefore, have been very shy in being open about their true debt position. And I think this is sort of, we'll talk about that, I'm sure, about when we're talking about debt transparency and so on. But this is a facet of the credit rating agencies that we need to think about. And a contradictory aspect to this was just earlier this year when Ecuador announced that it was no longer going to issue permits for oil exploration, as part of its efforts to deal with de-investment in fossil fuels and oil exploration. Credit rating agencies downgraded them and said this was a big mistake. They shouldn't have done something like that. And so you ask yourself, if a country is trying to do something about the climate situation and takes this decision, but is still being downgraded and therefore affecting its ability to access finance, then you have to question this idea of private credit and the role of private creditors in the debt market, and really what their developmental value addition is to a country's transformation and so on.
Yeah, and on that topic, I think what strikes me the most is I do some work in the area of ESG, right? Environment, social governance. So where is the ESG component of private creditors, right? Are they looking, is there a social conscience? Are they looking to better the environmental sustainability, or is it just about making a profit? And that seems to be the issue that you're raising with regard to the private sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we must not kid ourselves. Private agents, the one mantra is profit. We've seen a lot of greenwashing with guys like BlackRock and a few others who are trying to develop green bonds and so on. And this is a lot of greenwashing, and we need to be very careful that these are not sold as false solutions in terms of dealing with the climate emergency, whilst at the same time creating debt for developing countries to issue these green bonds and repay them back later at a margin. So I think this is very important in the conversation that we're having around the role of private credit in this ecosystem that we're currently facing.
And I think you had a fourth message as well. The third was overhauling
Yeah, the
the
fourth
debt
one is really
architecture.
about African sovereignty and African agency. We've on many occasions and continue to encourage African governments to go out there to these annual meetings and the spring meetings which take place in Washington to really say no to austerity, fiscal consolidation, and privatization. This is because these are the three messages that always come with any IMF program. You have fiscal consolidation because you need to deal with your public wage bill. You've got austerity, which means you've got to divert resources from public services to, at this current moment, as I keep saying on many occasions, the current IMF austerity measures are not geared towards raising revenues for public services. They're geared to raising revenues for debt servicing. And a recent UNCTAD report actually showed that in a number up to, I think, 32 African countries are actually diverting resources away from health and education in favor of debt service repayments. So it's quite severe. So it's push back a lot on that and push back on a lot of these IMF programs because the priority is the creditor and not African citizens. So those are the four key messages that we're sort of pushing at this point in time and in Marrakesh.
And this seems like a very broad question to a very detailed answer, but how do you make progress on all of these issues? I mean, you've got the IMF and the World Bank. You've got the private sector, which really is not part of the Paris Club, as far as I understand, and really not involved in. And you've got China and other bilateral lenders who are not necessarily willing to sort of jump on board and be transparent about their lending practices. Where do you start, and how much impact have you been able to have?
How much time do you have?
I can clear my schedule for the day, no problem.
Talking about small wins, look, I think it starts very much at the national level. When we engage with policymakers and lawmakers at the national level, and they begin to see some of our perspective and some of our dimensions on this work. The Mozambique tuna bond scandal is a very good example of what we need to do more of. Not necessarily the litigation, but more so the research and the analysis to understand. And if litigation, is the way then to go, then certainly we should do that. In countries like Zimbabwe, Kenya, Zambia, where a lot of civil society organizations triggered by those within the system that are sympathetic and understand the plight that we are facing, there have been a number of occasions where the judiciary has stepped in to interpret the law, the existing law around borrowing practices. And here AFRODAD has what we call a borrowing charter, which sets out a set of principles which are considered good principles for how borrowing countries should undertake their borrowing practices. But I think the judiciary is beginning to play a bit more of a role in interpreting these legal provisions and whether government is implementing them. I think a lot more of the public are getting interested in understanding what debt looks like and how it's, because of the high cost of living that we're experiencing right now, people are beginning to understand this a lot more. And members of parliament are also taking it very seriously. So I think at the national level, this is something that, we're beginning to see a bit more momentum build up, which is very encouraging. At the regional and continental level, the African Union Commission, for instance, has been investing a lot of political capital in trying to get member states towards a common position on debt. And, they have issued a number of statements on things like debt cancellation, debt service suspensions to be extended, and also to bring in all creditors to the table, given the current G21 common framework is not really working. Now, at the global level, of course, there are these opportunities, but I think it's also important to understand where there has been some movement and where there hasn't. Some of the newer creditors like China, they tend to want to act on their own. But in the case of Zambia, for instance, they were quite important in making sure that the deal was secured, albeit there had to be another set of renegotiations with them. But I think these are opportunities that we need to sort of jump on and see how best to make the best of these kinds of situations. So there are small wins that are taking place. There are instances that we as civil society on the continent just need to sort of come together around some of these wins and sort of see how to macro them up and scale them in terms of public mobilization and just encouraging more people to talk about this.
That's fascinating. And as you know, as a practitioner, I have sort of hived off a very narrow piece of this puzzle. And so it's very humbling to talk to you and hear about just all the interconnected issues that I don't touch on. But when it comes to some of the issues that I do touch on, for example, the role of Parliament in oversight of public debt, many of the countries that I've worked in since the I would say the end of COVID, when I was able to sort of travel again, I have noticed that there's not the level of openness towards addressing the debt situation that I would have expected. Now, that's very much on the, that does not address the inequities and the injustices. That really is about sort of, it's very much a prescriptive in terms of sort of moving forward. And I think, that's something that when I was in Mombasa at this workshop that one of your colleagues was at, working with 6 African countries, and I started to talk about the sort of oversight of public debt, et cetera, et cetera. The conversation with parliamentarians reverted back to those injustices and those inequities. And I recognized there that I had to sort of slow it down a little bit and show some empathy and demonstrate that this is not a necessarily, there are those inequities that exist, and that is the cause of the debt problem.
Yeah.
But moving forward, I guess the work that I do is solution oriented in terms of strengthening Parliament's role in oversight of public debt. And I think what I'm seeing in many cases, not only in Africa but also in the Asian countries that I've worked in, is it's really status quo in Parliament. There's really not a lot going on that demonstrates that Parliament is really seized by this issue, that it is front and center in their consciousness. And the way I describe it is that there's one of the countries that I worked at in Africa that you've already made reference to seems to be sleepwalking through the debt crisis. It's really business as usual. What are your thoughts on that somewhat cynical statement?
No. I mean, I do share that cynicism because, I think it's also a product of the political system that we have and the governance structures that we have on the continent. Certainly, whilst not absolving many of the parliamentary or other oversight institutions from their role, I think there has been a very lax approach to debt transparency and accountability. There has also been a sort of erosion in the role of oversight institutions and bodies in being able to actually challenge and bring people to account. And I think this is very, very problematic. And there's also been a centralization of power on the continent. If you sort of map where the debt crises are currently happening, you will see very quickly that there's a very unscientific correlation with the centralization of power and an erosion of public participation, public oversight, and also a sort of a weakening of institutions that play that policing role. But that notwithstanding, I think the entire ecosystem is at fault here because the international system that facilitates the lending continues to lend. And I think this is what becomes very problematic when we're talking about solutions, because yes, we can push for all sorts of manner of transparency and accountability policies, laws in a developing country on the continent or on the continent more generally. But if lenders are not willing to use those laws to ensure that they're enforced when they are lending, then it becomes very problematic. And I think this is symptomatic of the proliferation of the creditor landscape. There is no incentive for an equity firm or an investment bank to say, well, I need to make sure that there's a law on how you publish your debt register. They don't really care. What they want to see is that their bonds are paid on time so that their shareholders or the bondholders get their return. And unfortunately, they now make up the majority of the debt portfolio on the continent. Whereas, at least in the past, you'd have had a multilateral development bank or a bilateral lender pay a little bit more attention. Now, I'm not saying this is also going back to the whole point of conditionality and allowing African governments to do what they want to do. But I think, there needs to be some sort of pragmatic approach where citizens, parliaments, judiciaries, auditor general offices pay a lot more closer attention. I think that it's their role, and they need to find a way of challenging this usurping of power away from them to primarily the executive arm of government. It's not the role for the MDBs or the bilateral lenders to action that or to impose that restriction. I think it's up to us on the continent to pay for parliamentarians to take a lot more attention to this. And I do think as the crisis deepens on the continent, which it will, and a lot more countries sort of edge towards the precipice of defaulting or struggling to pay their debts, I do feel a lot of institutions are going to be, forced with this sort of quote unquote day of reckoning, where they actually stand up and be counted and say, we want to know more. We want to actually understand what is happening on the debt side of things.
Mm-hmm. And just to keep this going for a moment, when you work on issues like debt transparency, and if you're sitting down with a government or a parliament in Africa, and you're saying, there are issues around that, some issues of corruption, issues of borrowing for purposes that are unproductive, et cetera, are adding to the debt crisis or have helped to create the debt crisis. Mm-hmm. What type of reaction do you get? Do they revert back to the inequities, which is certainly legitimate, or is there some acceptance of responsibility on their part for the role that they've played in some of the?
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, it would depend on which side of the political divide the parliamentarians are. I mean, those who are in government, of course, will defend it to the tilt, right? Those who are in opposition will make all sorts of claims that it's fraudulent, it's not aligned to the development agenda or the budget. I think what is very evident, though, that Parliament, is at the moment being very shy across the continent in actually asking or requiring ministers to come and give evidence around how their borrowing plans are. I think also that there is this general acceptance that borrowing is okay. It's a medium of getting money into the coffers, and then using it for developmental purposes or whatever purposes that they end up being used for. And so there's very little at that point when ideologically or operationally Parliament views debt as being okay. So it's very difficult to challenge this. I think we have seen on many occasions where the auditor generals have published reports saying they don't know where this debt finance was used, where it was invested. I think this is the entry point for parliamentarians, I feel, that we have been using as well. I think the other bit is to, hit it target it where it hits them the hardest, which is this has a direct impact on the cost of government and the cost of running government. And when fiscal consolidation is being proposed, that has a direct hit on not just public services, but eventually it could come and hit Parliament and therefore hit them as parliamentarians. Because sometimes that is kind of the language that is understood in our context. And that if that becomes the way to address the situation, I think that's a strategy that one could use. And lastly, I think we need to empower, I feel, Auditor General subcommittees in Parliament as well, in understanding that it's not just the value of the debt. I think there are three other components that they need to be able to understand, which is the terms of repayment. This is the timeline, interest versus capital, and then the interest rate. And I think for many of those of our legislators, many of our those who are making laws, pay very little attention to those dimensions. And so we've been trying to sort of facilitate that sort of capacity enhancement and capacity dialogue on these dimensions of debt contraction, so that they can understand that, if you then want to advocate for borrowing, at least get good terms.
Yes.
Avoid the bonds, avoid the private credit, because their turnarounds are very short. And if you don't hit the return, you're likely to find yourself having to default. So that's sort of also a different strategy that we're using to help people engage in this conversation.
And is that ex ante? In other words, is that tied to parliamentary ratification of loan agreements, for example, or is this sort of after the fact and looking at annual borrowing plans?
No, I think it's definitely prior. It has to be, because Parliament needs to be aware of what the government's borrowing plans are. I mean, there are, in many African countries, in the budget and the national budgeting process, government needs to present its financing plans, including its borrowing plans. And I think it's at that point where parliamentarians need to step in and say, well, we want to know what are the terms and conditions of the different creditors you're engaging, and how does this match with the revenue projections that you're also putting in those plans. So it's not ex ante, definitely.
Are there any countries in Africa that, and I ask that as a very broadly because, of course, you're AFRODAD, you're representing African countries. Are there any countries where you've seen strong oversight practices that have contributed to strong oversight of public debt?
We've got sort of dotted or peppered examples. I wouldn't say there's probably a standout. I mean, countries like Benin have been very, are a standout country in terms of the kind of policy and legal framework they have in place for enhancing and strengthening debt transparency and accountability. Here in Kenya, where I'm currently based, we have quite a fair bit of information available in the public domain. If you're patient enough to deal with the many 404 forbidden pages before you land on the right one, you will get there eventually. But they do have, in Kenya, they have published quite a bit. But there's always more that can be done. I think the role of the judiciary, as we've seen in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Zambia, is also very encouraging. The fact that civil society and interested members of public can join a public interest litigation case on debt transparency, I think is very, very good. I think in the case of Zimbabwe, it's happened on 2 occasions where the court has ruled in favor of civil society organizations and demanding that the government publishes its data, debt data, in a timely way and in a comprehensible way. So, and I think it has also given rise to the Debt Management Office in Zimbabwe now seeking inputs from civil society on how to develop its annual debt statistics, of which AFRODAD and our national partner, the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, have been able to do. And inputting into the improvement and strengthening of that annual debt statistics report is quite useful. Of course, in Zambia, the case was not won, but it did ask or pose a lot of legal questions around who is supposed to borrow, under what circumstances, because the case there was more about was a former minister who at the time was holding a portfolio that was not finance, were they allowed to borrow on behalf of the government?
I see.
And as it turns out, constitutionally, there's a bit of a gray area, but the court sort of saw it okay that the minister did borrow. Though in many countries, this is not the practice. Normally borrowing is under the purview of the Ministry of Finance or the National Treasury. So I think these are the things I'd say that I would say, in countries where we're seeing good things happening. In North Africa, I think it's Tunisia, if I'm not mistaken. They've been very hard in pushing back against IMF programs because of they too are going through a bit of a debt problem. But, they've been very strong in saying that they don't want the fiscal consolidation and austerity. So I mean, like I said, they are peppered across the continent, but there is progress, and this is something that we just need to build on and continue sort of coalescing around these small wins, and hopefully then there will be a point in time, hopefully not in the too distant future, where there is a critical mass and we can probably start a Jubilee 2.0. We could even start thinking about a collective default for the continent. Who knows? The options are endless at this point, given the level of desperation that this continent is likely to face in the next sort of 3 to 5 years.
Well, Jason Braganza, the executive director of AFRODAD, it seems like a good time to end our interview, even though I could pepper you with hundreds of more questions. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time and for helping myself and listeners to understand the interconnectedness of these issues. Debt is not a simple issue, and it sounds like you're doing a lot of hard work at AFRODAD to forward the knowledge making of or the awareness of organizations about their role. And I wish you well and hope to talk to you again.
Geoff, thank you so much for having me, and it's been a huge pleasure speaking with you during this session. It's been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and take good care.
Cheers. Thank you.
Human Coined is an integral part of Nexus PFM Consulting. If you enjoyed this episode, you can also find us on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. If you have any questions about the work we do, you can contact us at info@nexuspfm.com.